Chapter 1. The Savior and the King. The clang of swords echoed through the dark forest as Alpha Cedric Holloway cut down the last of the assassins. His blade gleamed with blood, his breath ragged from the fight. Around him the ground was littered with bodies, men in black cloaks, their faces obscured beneath hoods. "General Holloway," a knight called, rushing toward him. "The king! He's injured!" Cedric's golden eyes sharpened. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He raced through the clearing toward the figure collapsed at the base of a tree. King Maximilian Devereaux lay cradling his side, crimson blood seeping between his pale fingers. "Your Majesty," Cedric knelt before him, tearing a strip from his tunic to press against the wound. "You're hurt." Maximilian's silver-gray eyes fluttered open. Even in pain, his gaze was piercing. He lifted a shaky hand, brushing it against Cedric's cheek. "You came for me," he whispered. "I was doing my duty." Cedric ignored the flutter in his chest as Maximilian's fingers lingered on his jaw. He had seen the king many times at court, admired his strength and elegance from afar. But this closeness, it was dangerous. "You saved my life," Maximilian murmured, his breath ghosting against Cedric's skin. His gaze sharpened with something more than gratitude. "How can I ever repay you?" Cedric swallowed hard. "There's no need for repayment, Your Majesty. Protecting the crown is my honor." Maximilian's gaze darkened. Honor alone won't suffice. Before Cedric could respond, the king's guards arrived, surrounding them. Maximilian's hand lingered on Cedric's cheek for a moment longer, before he allowed himself to be pulled away. Cedric watched him disappear into the darkness, the feeling of the king's touch burning into his skin. Days later, Cedric stood stiffly in the grand hall of the palace, dressed in his formal armor. Marble pillars stretched toward a vaulted ceiling, where banners of the royal crest fluttered gently in the breeze. He had been summoned for an audience with the king, a rare and unexpected honor. The heavy doors opened, and King Maximilian entered the room. He was dressed in black and silver robes, his crown glinting beneath the light of the chandeliers. He approached Cedric with a measured grace, his silver eyes fixed unflinchingly on Cedric's face. "Kneel," the king commanded softly. Cedric hesitated only a moment before dropping to one knee. Maximilian stepped closer, his gloved hand cupping Cedric's chin and tilting his head upward. "Cedric Holloway," he said, his tone both regal and intimate. "You have done a great service to the crown. You saved my life. I wish to offer you a reward." "There's no need, Your Majesty." Cedric's voice was steady despite the heat creeping into his cheeks at the king's closeness. "But I insist." Maximilian's eyes gleamed. "I wish to take you as my consort." Cedric's head jerked up. "Your Majesty, I am not asking." Maximilian's hand lingered beneath Cedric's chin, his thumb brushing the corner of his jaw. "As an enigma, I have the right to bond with another alpha, and I have chosen you." Cedric's breath hitched. Alphas didn't bond with other alphas unless one of them was an enigma, a rare and coveted status that gave the power to conceive. That the king was proposing such a bond was unheard of. "My king, you can't possibly—" "Am I not worthy?" Maximilian's gaze sharpened. "Or do you not find me desirable?" Cedric's mouth opened, but no words came out. Of course, Maximilian was desirable, too much so. He was elegant and dangerous, his beauty sharp enough to cut. But Cedric wasn't a fool. There was more at play here than gratitude. "I am honored," Cedric said slowly, "but I cannot accept." Maximilian's eyes darkened. "You will," he said softly, "in time." The king leaned closer until his breath brushed against Cedric's ear. "Because you are already mine." That night, Cedric lay awake in his chambers, the king's words echoing through his mind. He couldn't deny the pull he felt toward Maximilian, the heat in his gaze, the possessiveness in his touch. But this was a dangerous ground. And yet, when Cedric closed his eyes, all he could see was silver-gray eyes piercing into his soul and the ghost of the king's hand on his skin. Juarez. Chapter 2. The King's Trap. Cedric stood at the edge of the grand balcony, his hands gripping the marble railing as the cool evening breeze swept through the palace grounds. The city below glittered beneath the pale moonlight, but Cedric's heart was heavy. His chest tightened with the weight of the decision he had made just hours ago. He had agreed to marry King Maximilian Devereaux. Even now, he wasn't sure how it had happened. He had resisted, tried to push the king away, but Maximilian had been relentless. His unwavering devotion, the way he spoke to Cedric not as a knight but as a man he desired. Slowly, Cedric's resolve had crumbled. "I don't understand why it has to be me," Cedric had said just hours ago in the king's private chambers. Maximilian had stood before him dressed in black and silver, his crown resting lightly on his head. His expression had been calm, but his silver eyes burned with quiet intensity. "Because you are the only one I trust," Maximilian had answered, "the only one I desire." Maximilian had stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on Cedric's chest. "Let me take care of you," he had whispered. "Let me give you everything." Cedric had felt himself weaken under the weight of Maximilian's gaze and the quiet promise in his touch. Against his better judgment, his mouth had formed the words before his mind could stop them. Yes. 3 weeks earlier, Maximilian stood in the shadows of the council chamber, his gaze cold as he listened to the nobles speak. "General Holloway is a military asset, not a political one of the ministers had said. "It would be unwise to bind him to the crown." Maximilian's jaw tightened. Foolish men. They saw Cedric as nothing more than a tool to be used, a sword to wield when necessary. None of them could possibly understand how valuable Cedric truly was, how long Maximilian had waited for him. He had known Cedric Holloway for years, had watched him rise through the ranks of the knights with quiet strength and unwavering loyalty. It had been Maximilian's plan all along to make Cedric his. The ambush was just the final step. A staged threat, carefully calculated to put Cedric in the position of a savior. And Cedric had performed perfectly. But Cedric's loyalty as a knight wouldn't be enough. Maximilian needed Cedric bound to him completely, by blood, by marriage, by love. A political alliance was not enough. Maximilian had already seen to it that any potential suitors were quietly removed from the equation. The Duke's daughter, who had been rumored to catch Cedric's eye, married off to a distant lord within days. The young nobleman who had grown too friendly with Cedric at court, suddenly accused of treason and sent into exile. And when Cedric had been assigned to a dangerous border mission, one Maximilian hadn't sanctioned, it had been Maximilian himself who had intercepted the order and had it redirected. No one was going to take Cedric away from him. Maximilian's lips curled into a small, dangerous smile as he watched the council squabble. It didn't matter what they thought. Cedric was his now, and soon the whole kingdom would know it. Present day. The grand hall of the palace buzzed with anticipation. Chandeliers glittered above the massive room, and nobles in silk and jewels filled the space, whispering behind their fans. Cedric stood at the head of the aisle, dressed in formal ceremonial armor, adorned with silver embroidery. His hair was neatly pulled back, and a jeweled sword hung at his side. He felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, but none of them mattered. The heavy doors opened. Maximilian entered, dressed in deep crimson robes lined with gold, his crown glinting beneath the light. His silver eyes were calm and focused, fixed solely on Cedric. Cedric's chest tightened. He knew he should feel nervous, should feel like this was all happening too fast. But when Maximilian stepped toward him and took his hand, the king's touch was steady, grounding. Maximilian's thumb brushed over Cedric's knuckles as the officiant began the sacred vows. "Do you, Maximilian Devereaux, take Cedric Holloway as your bonded mate and consort?" Maximilian's gaze never wavered. "I do." "And do you, Cedric Holloway, take Maximilian Devereaux as your bonded mate and consort?" Cedric hesitated, his heart thundering in his chest. He glanced toward Maximilian, his strong jawline, the quiet devotion in his eyes. Maximilian had been relentless, but he had also been unwaveringly kind. Protective. Steady. Cedric took a shaky breath. "I do." Maximilian's smile was small, but the fierce satisfaction behind it made Cedric's stomach tighten. The king leaned down and kissed him. The crowd erupted into cheers as Maximilian pulled Cedric close, his hand possessively resting at Cedric's back. Cedric's hands trembled as they slid over Maximilian's chest. He could feel the heat of Maximilian's breath against his ear. "You're mine now," Maximilian whispered darkly, his hand tightening at Cedric's waist. "Forever." Later that night, Cedric sat at the edge of the royal bedchamber, still dressed in his wedding robes. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the air was thick with the scent of wine and roses. Maximilian sat beside him, his gaze steady. Slowly, he reached out and took Cedric's hand. "You'll be safe here," Maximilian said softly. Cedric's heart raced. "What if I'm not ready for this?" Maximilian leaned closer, his thumb brushing against Cedric's jaw. "Then I'll wait." His silver eyes darkened. "But I won't let you go." Cedric's breath caught. He should have been afraid, but as Maximilian's arms slid around him and pulled him down onto the silk sheets, all Cedric felt was warmth. "You saved my life," Maximilian whispered. "Let me spend the rest of my life proving that you belong with me." Cedric closed his eyes, allowing himself to be drawn into the king's embrace. Far beneath the surface of that quiet tenderness lay something dark and dangerous, but Cedric was too tired to care. For tonight, Maximilian's arms felt safe. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 3. The King's Mark. Cedric's breath hitched as Maximilian's lips traced the curve of his throat. The royal bedchamber was dark except for the flicker of candlelight reflecting off the silk sheets beneath them. Cedric's armor lay discarded on the marble floor, and his hands rested on Maximilian's bare shoulders as the king leaned over him, his silver eyes burning with dark intensity. "You're trembling," Maximilian whispered, his lips brushing against Cedric's ear. Cedric swallowed hard. I'm not used to this." Maximilian's gaze sharpened. His hand slid down Cedric's chest, his fingers tracing the scars from years of battle. "You fought wars," Maximilian murmured. "But this?" His mouth curved into a small, dangerous smile. "This you fear?" Cedric's cheeks burned. "It's different." Maximilian's hand moved to Cedric's jaw, tilting his head upward. His eyes darkened. "Then let me make you understand." Without warning, Maximilian's fangs grazed Cedric's neck. Cedric's body tensed as the sharp sting of teeth pressed into his skin, followed by a wave of searing warmth that spread through his veins. "Ah!" Cedric gasped, clutching at Maximilian's shoulders. Maximilian pulled back, his lips stained red as he licked the mark on Cedric's neck. His silver eyes gleamed with possessive triumph. "There," he whispered darkly. "Now you're mine." Cedric's hand flew to his neck. His heart hammered beneath his chest. An enigma's mark was permanent. It bound them together at a primal level. Their connection was now sealed through blood and instinct. "Why?" Cedric's voice was strained. "Why would you—" Maximilian's lips claimed his before he could finish the question. The kiss was deep, claiming, no room for hesitation. Cedric's mind went blank as Maximilian pulled him down into the sheets, their bodies pressing together. "You belong to me now," Maximilian whispered against his mouth. "No one will touch you. No one will take you from me." And as Maximilian's mouth found his once more, Cedric surrendered. Days later, Cedric sat at the window of the royal chamber, one hand unconsciously brushing over the mark on his neck. It still pulsed faintly beneath his skin, a constant reminder of the bond now tying him to Maximilian. Maximilian had changed since the night he marked Cedric. He was softer, more attentive. His hand lingered on Cedric's back during court sessions, and he stood a little closer when they walked through the palace gardens. At night, he pulled Cedric into his arms without asking, his breath steady against Cedric's hair as they slept. And Cedric was starting to want it. That realization terrified him. He had never intended to fall for Maximilian. But the king's devotion was a weight Cedric couldn't ignore. And beneath that devotion lay something fierce and dangerous. "General." Cedric turned toward the sound of the guard's voice. A knight stood at the door, his expression tense. "His Majesty requested your presence in the council chamber." Cedric rose and adjusted his tunic. He was just stepping into the corridor when the sound of hurried footsteps reached his ears. "My lord!" Pain exploded at the side of his head. Cedric stumbled back as rough hands grabbed him, yanking him down the hallway. He struggled, but a sharp blow to his stomach knocked the breath from his lungs. A black cloth was forced over his head. And then darkness. Maximilian's wrath. Maximilian's hand crushed the arm of the throne as the captain of the guard knelt before him, head bowed low. "They took him." Maximilian's silver eyes darkened. "Who?" "We don't know yet, Your Majesty," the captain said carefully, "but the knights are searching the city." A dangerous silence settled over the throne room. Maximilian's hand slid from the armrest of the throne, his expression ice cold. "Find them." His voice was low and dangerous. "And when you do, kill them." The captain hesitated. "Your Majesty." Maximilian rose from the throne. His long black cloak swept behind him as he descended the steps. "Did I stutter?" The guard stiffened. "No, Your Majesty." Maximilian's eyes flashed with rage. "Bring him back, or I will burn this city to the ground." Cedric's arms were bound behind his back, his head still spinning from the blow. He sat on the floor of a dark, damp room. A man's shadow loomed before him. "So," the man sneered, "the king's little pet." Cedric's eyes sharpened. His jaw tightened. "You'll regret this." The man laughed. "Will I?" He crouched before Cedric. "What's it like being the king's toy? Did you think he actually loved you?" Cedric's eyes narrowed. "Careful." Suddenly, the door behind them exploded inward. A wall of black-cloaked knights stormed the room, cutting down the guards. Cedric's head snapped up as a figure stepped through the wreckage. Maximilian. He was dressed in dark armor, his silver eyes burning with cold fury. He crossed the room in 3 strides and drove his sword through the man's chest without hesitation. The body crumpled to the ground at Cedric's feet. Maximilian dropped to his knees before Cedric, his hands cupping Cedric's face. His breath was ragged, his eyes wide and wild. "My love," he whispered, "are you hurt?" Cedric's throat tightened. "I'm fine." Maximilian's hands moved to Cedric's wrists, tearing apart the bindings. His fingers trembled as they slid over Cedric's bruises. "You're mine," Maximilian murmured. "No one touches you. No one takes you from me." Cedric's hands slid over Maximilian's wrists. "You came for me." Maximilian's eyes sharpened. "I will always come for you." Cedric's chest ached. He didn't know when it had happened, when the fear had turned into trust. But as Maximilian's arms slid around him, Cedric let himself lean into the king's warmth. And for the first time, Cedric didn't pull away. Later that night, Cedric lay in bed, Maximilian's arms curled around him. The king's breath was slow and steady against Cedric's shoulder. "You scared me," Maximilian murmured. Cedric's hand covered Maximilian's. "You found me." Maximilian's lips brushed over Cedric's mark. His hand slid down to rest over Cedric's abdomen. "I'll always find you," Maximilian whispered, "because you're mine." Cedric's eyes closed. His hand covered Maximilian's on his stomach, his heart steady beneath his chest. He was starting to believe it. Chapter 4. Bound by Blood. Cedric sat beneath the sprawling canopy of the royal gardens, sunlight filtering through the leaves and casting soft shadows over his face. A cool breeze stirred the summer air, but Cedric barely noticed it. His hand rested over the swell of his stomach, a constant, grounding reminder of the life growing inside him. He was pregnant. The realization had left him stunned at first when he found the news 1 month ago. He had known that enigmas were capable of making other alphas pregnant. It was a rare trait, almost unheard of, but he had never imagined it would happen to him. Maximilian had been thrilled. "You've given me a gift," Maximilian had whispered the night Cedric told him. He had pulled Cedric close, pressing soft kisses to his neck. "You've given me a piece of you." From that moment, Maximilian's protectiveness had grown tenfold. He wouldn't let Cedric train with the knights anymore, wouldn't even let him lift a sword. Guards shadowed Cedric wherever he went, and Maximilian insisted on carrying Cedric up the stairs when he was too tired to walk. At first, Cedric had found it overbearing, but as the weeks passed, he started to feel safe. Safe in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Maximilian's hand was always there to steady him, his voice always calm when Cedric's worries became too much. Cedric hated to admit it, but he had started to need Maximilian more and more by each passing day, and that terrified him. 7 months later, Cedric stood in the royal chambers, his hands pressed to the curve of his swollen belly. His breathing was unsteady. He had felt restless all day, an unnamed tension humming beneath his skin. "My love," Maximilian's voice broke through the quiet. Cedric turned as Maximilian entered the room, dressed in dark silk robes. His silver eyes softened when they fell on Cedric's belly. He crossed the room and knelt before Cedric, his hands sliding over Cedric's waist to rest gently on his stomach. "Are you tired?" Maximilian's thumb traced slow circles over Cedric's belly. "Shall I have the servants bring you something?" Cedric sighed. "You don't have to treat me like I'm fragile." Maximilian's lips curled into a faint smile. "But you are." He leaned in, pressing a kiss to Cedric's stomach. "You're carrying our child." Cedric's heart squeezed painfully in his chest. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax into the warmth of Maximilian's hands. Then, "My lord." Cedric's head snapped up as one of the royal guards entered the room, bowing low. "The prisoner has confessed." Maximilian's expression darkened. "What prisoner?" The guard hesitated. "The traitor who arranged the ambush 7 months ago. He confessed under pressure. He said it was staged on royal orders." Cedric's breath stilled. Slowly, his gaze turned toward Maximilian. "Royal orders?" Cedric's voice was sharp. The guard's gaze flicked nervously toward Maximilian. "Yes, General. He said the ambush was ordered by—" "Enough." Maximilian's tone was quiet but cold. The guard's mouth shut instantly. Cedric's heartbeat thundered in his ears. His hands curled over his stomach. "Maximilian!" Maximilian's gaze sharpened. "Did you order the ambush?" Cedric's voice was deadly calm. Maximilian didn't speak at first. His silver eyes were unnervingly steady. Slowly, he rose to his feet and approached Cedric. "You knew," Cedric said, his voice rising. "You knew about the ambush." "Yes." Cedric's breath hitched. "You planned it?" Maximilian stepped closer. Cedric's hand went protectively to his stomach, but Maximilian's hand covered his grip warm and steady. "Yes." Maximilian's voice was quiet. "I planned it all." Cedric's body tensed. "Why?" Maximilian's thumb brushed over Cedric's knuckles. His silver eyes darkened with dangerous devotion. "Because I needed you." Cedric's eyes widened. His chest tightened painfully. "You used me." "No?" Maximilian's hand slid to Cedric's jaw, tilting his face upward. His thumb traced the curve of Cedric's cheek. "I saved you." Cedric's voice shook. "You manipulated me. You staged an ambush. You forced me into this marriage." Maximilian's smile was small and sharp. "And you stayed." Cedric's breath shuddered. "You—" Maximilian's hands slid down to Cedric's swollen belly, pressing gently but possessively. Cedric's body stiffened. "You're carrying our child now," Maximilian whispered. "You've already given yourself to me." Cedric's hands trembled. "You never gave me a choice." Maximilian's eyes flashed. "You would have left." His hands tightened over Cedric's waist. "I couldn't let that happen." Cedric's eyes filled with tears. "You betrayed me." "I gave you a life," Maximilian whispered fiercely. His hand slid over Cedric's stomach. "And now you'll give me another." Cedric shook his head. "You—" Maximilian's mouth brushed over Cedric's temple. "You're mine, Cedric." His hands caressed the curve of Cedric's belly, his touch possessive and tender. "You will always be mine." Cedric's breath hitched. Maximilian's mouth brushed over his ear. "I'll never let you go. Not now, not ever." Cedric's heart pounded painfully beneath his ribs. His hand gripped Maximilian's wrist. He should have pulled away, but his body betrayed him, leaning into the heat of Maximilian's touch. You You're insane, Cedric whispered. Maximilian's hand slid down to Cedric's waist. Perhaps? His silver eyes gleamed. But you're still mine. Cedric's knees weakened. Maximilian caught him easily, his arm curling protectively around Cedric's back. I'll protect you, Maximilian murmured. You and our child. No one will touch you. No one will take you from me. Cedric's hand slid over his swollen belly. He should have been angry, should have pushed Maximilian away. But Maximilian's arms were warm, steady, grounding him even as his world fell apart. Maximilian's lips pressed over the mark on Cedric's neck. You're carrying our child, Maximilian whispered. You'll never escape me now. Cedric's eyes burned with tears. His hand gripped Maximilian's wrist, but he didn't pull away. His body trembled, but his heart had already betrayed him. Maximilian's hand slid over Cedric's belly, resting possessively over the life growing there. You're mine, Maximilian whispered. Forever. Chapter 5. Forever Bound. Cedric stood at the edge of the royal balcony, his hands resting over the curve of his swollen belly. The sun was setting beyond the palace walls, casting a golden glow over the distant hills. The weight in his chest had settled into a cold, sharp knot. Maximilian had betrayed him. He had known about the ambush, orchestrated it, manipulated Cedric's choices, forced his hand. And yet, Cedric had stayed. He could feel Maximilian's presence before he heard his footsteps. The king's dark robes rustled as he approached. Cedric! Cedric's jaw tightened. He didn't turn. Go away. Maximilian's hand slid over his shoulder, gentle but unwavering. I can't. Cedric's hand curled over the railing. His heart hammered painfully beneath his chest. You lied to me. I did. Cedric turned his head, his eyes sharp with quiet fury. You manipulated me into this marriage. Yes. Cedric's voice sharpened. You don't even regret it. Maximilian's silver eyes darkened. I regret hurting you. His hand slid over Cedric's arm. But I do not regret having you. Cedric's breath hitched. His gaze dropped to the floor. You... Maximilian's arm slid around Cedric's waist from behind, his hands resting over Cedric's swollen stomach. His breath ghosted against Cedric's ear. I love you, Maximilian whispered. Cedric's heart squeezed painfully. His throat tightened. You don't manipulate people you love, Cedric said softly. Maximilian's grip tightened. You would have left me. Cedric stiffened. I had to do something. Maximilian's lips brushed over Cedric's temple. His hands slid protectively over Cedric's belly. If you left, I wouldn't have survived it. Cedric's chest burned. You had no right to take that choice from me. Maximilian's breath steadied. His hand covered Cedric's. You're right. Cedric's eyes widened. I should have trusted you, Maximilian said softly. His thumb traced slow circles over Cedric's hand. I swear, Cedric, I will never deceive you again. Cedric's breath shuddered. And if I decide to leave? Maximilian's hand stilled over Cedric's. His eyes sharpened with dark intensity. I would let you go. Cedric's eyes narrowed. You're lying. Maximilian's gaze softened with quiet danger. Try it. His hand slid protectively over Cedric's belly. You can't leave me now. Cedric's cheeks flushed. His hands curled over Maximilian's wrist, but he didn't pull away. You're impossible, Cedric whispered. Maximilian's mouth curved faintly. His lips brushed over the mark on Cedric's neck. I know. 2 months later, Cedric screamed as pain tore through his body. His hands gripped the silk sheets beneath him as another contraction racked his body. Maximilian's hand was steady in his silver eyes blazing with fierce intensity. You're doing beautifully, Maximilian whispered. His lips pressed over Cedric's knuckles. Just a little longer, my love. I swear to the gods, if you tell me to just breathe one more time. Maximilian's mouth curved faintly. I would never be that foolish. Cedric's head dropped back against the pillows. He squeezed Maximilian's hand tightly as another contraction tore through him. His breath hitched. Maximilian's hand curled over Cedric's wrist. His gaze softened. "You're almost there, my love." Cedric's breath shuddered. His heart hammered painfully beneath his chest. But then, a sharp cry split the air. Cedric's head lifted. His chest tightened as the midwife lifted a small, wailing bundle into the air. "A boy," the midwife whispered. "A strong, healthy boy." Cedric's breath hitched. His eyes blurred with tears. Maximilian's expression softened into quiet awe as the midwife gently placed the child into Cedric's arms. Cedric's trembling hands curled around the small, fragile body. The child had dark hair and pale skin, his tiny fists curling weakly. Slowly, the baby's cries quieted as Cedric's hand brushed over his small cheek. Cedric's voice cracked. "He's perfect." Maximilian's hand slid over Cedric's shoulder. His gaze softened as he looked down at the child. "He looks like you," Maximilian murmured. Cedric's lips trembled. "No, he looks like you." Maximilian's hand slid over the curve of Cedric's waist. His lips brushed over Cedric's temple. "You've given me everything," Maximilian whispered. Cedric's chest squeezed. He looked up, his gaze steady. "And you'll never let me leave now," Cedric said quietly. Maximilian's hand slid protectively over Cedric's waist. His silver eyes gleamed with dark devotion. "Not now, not ever." Weeks later, Cedric sat beneath the canopy of the royal gardens, the small bundle of their son resting in his arms. The baby's tiny hand curled around Cedric's finger, his dark lashes fluttering softly in sleep. Footsteps approached behind him. Cedric didn't need to look to know who it was. Maximilian's hand slid over Cedric's shoulder. "You're doing it again," Cedric said softly. Maximilian's brow lifted. "Doing what?" "Staring at me." Maximilian's hand slid down to Cedric's waist, his thumb brushing slow circles over Cedric's hip. "You make it difficult to look away," Maximilian whispered. Cedric's heart fluttered painfully. He leaned back into Maximilian's touch, his gaze softening. "You're still impossible," Cedric murmured. Maximilian's lips brushed over Cedric's hair. "And yet," Maximilian whispered, "you're still here." Cedric's eyes dropped to the child in his arms. His lips curved faintly. "Yes." Maximilian's hand slid protectively over Cedric's waist. "Because you're mine." Cedric sighed. Possessive. Maximilian's hand slid over Cedric's cheek, lifting his gaze. His silver eyes gleamed beneath the afternoon light. "Say it," Maximilian whispered. Cedric's breath shuddered. His hand curled over Maximilian's wrist. "I'm yours," Cedric whispered. Maximilian's mouth curled into a dark, satisfied smile. His hand slid down to cover Cedric's belly once more. "And you always will be," Maximilian murmured. Cedric's heart hammered painfully beneath his chest, but he didn't pull away. Instead, his head lowered toward their sleeping child. Maximilian's arm tightened around Cedric's waist. His lips brushed over Cedric's temple. Cedric's heart steadied. He was bound to Maximilian now, in blood and devotion. And somehow, despite everything, Cedric found himself content. Epilogue. Forever and always. Years had passed since Cedric gave birth to their first child, and life within the kingdom had settled into a quiet, steady rhythm. Peace had returned to the court, and with it, the once looming shadows of political unrest faded beneath the reign of King Maximilian Devereux and his beloved consort, General Cedric Devereux. Cedric stood at the edge of the training grounds, his gaze steady as he watched the knights practice below. His sword was strapped to his side, the hilt worn from years of use. He had resumed his work as the general shortly after giving birth, and despite Maximilian's protests, Cedric had insisted on continuing his duties. Maximilian had reluctantly agreed, but not without conditions. Guards followed Cedric everywhere within the palace, though they kept their distance when Cedric ordered them to, and Maximilian still insisted on personally escorting Cedric back to their chambers after training. Every day, without fail. A quiet laugh escaped Cedric's lips. Some things never changed. Father! Cedric's gaze lifted as a young boy ran across the training ground toward him. Dark curls framed his face, and his silver eyes shone beneath the midday sun. His features mirrored both Cedric and Maximilian, a perfect blend of their bloodlines. Leon, Cedric smiled. The boy skidded to a stop before him, flushed with excitement. His small wooden sword was strapped to his waist. I beat Sir Rowan in the sparring match, Leon beamed. Cedric crouched, brushing a hand through Leon's curls. Did you now? Leon's chest puffed out proudly. Father said I'd make a great king one day. Cedric's heart softened. His hand slid over Leon's shoulder. You'll have to work hard then. I will. Leon's silver eyes gleamed. Cedric smiled. His hand rested briefly over Leon's head before standing. Now, off to the stables. You promised to meet your uncle there. Leon nodded eagerly before taking off toward the stables. Cedric watched him go, warmth swelling beneath his chest. His hand brushed over his stomach, a familiar flutter stirring beneath his palm. Careful, a low voice murmured behind him. Warm hands slid around Cedric's waist from behind. Cedric's body relaxed instantly as Maximilian's arms curled around him. You shouldn't push yourself, Maximilian murmured. His hand brushed over Cedric's slightly swollen belly. Not when you're carrying our daughters. Cedric's lips curled faintly. His hand slid over Maximilian's. You worry too much. Maximilian's silver eyes darkened. His hand pressed protectively over Cedric's stomach. You give me reasons to worry, Maximilian whispered. His mouth brushed over the mark on Cedric's neck. I'm not letting you out of my sight this time. Cedric's eyes narrowed. You said that when I was pregnant with Leon. And I meant it. Cedric sighed. I'm not fragile. You're carrying our children. Maximilian's hand slid over Cedric's stomach, possessive and steady. You're mine. Cedric rolled his eyes. You can't claim me forever. Maximilian's mouth brushed over Cedric's ear. His arms tightened around Cedric's waist. Watch me, Maximilian whispered. Cedric's heart hammered painfully beneath his chest. His hands slid over Maximilian's wrists, but he didn't pull away. He leaned back against Maximilian's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of his husband's breath. Maximilian's hand slid over Cedric's belly. They're strong. His silver eyes darkened with quiet satisfaction, just like you. Cedric's gaze softened. His hand covered Maximilian's. Do you think they'll look like you? Cedric murmured. Maximilian's mouth curved faintly. I hope not. Cedric's brow lifted. Maximilian's lips brushed over Cedric's hair. If they look like you, I'll never survive it. Cedric's chest squeezed painfully. You're impossible, Cedric whispered. Maximilian's mouth curled into a faint smile. And yet you're still here. Cedric's lips pressed together. His hand tightened over Maximilian's. You're lucky I love you. Maximilian's eyes darkened with quiet intensity. His hand slid down to cover Cedric's waist. No, Maximilian whispered. You are the lucky one. Cedric's mouth opened to protest, but then Maximilian's hand slid lower over Cedric's belly, his touch soft and steady. I love you, Maximilian whispered, madly, obsessively. His silver eyes gleamed. Forever. Cedric's chest tightened. He hated how easily Maximilian could unravel him, but it was too late to fight it now. His hand curled over Maximilian's wrist. Forever, Cedric murmured. Maximilian's arms tightened around him. His mouth brushed over Cedric's temple. You're mine, Maximilian whispered. Forever. Cedric sighed. I know. Month later. Cedric sat in bed, his arms cradling two small bundles wrapped in silk. His daughter's dark lashes fluttered as they slept, their small hands curled delicately beneath their chins. One of them had silver eyes like Maximilian. The other had soft brown curls like Cedric's. Maximilian sat beside Cedric, his gaze steady, as he looked down at their daughters. His hand slid over Cedric's, his touch possessive and tender. They're perfect, Cedric whispered. Maximilian's gaze sharpened. His hand curled protectively over Cedric's waist. They're ours, Maximilian whispered. His hand slid over Cedric's cheek, lifting his gaze. Cedric's breath steadied beneath the weight of Maximilian's touch. He knew that look. Dark, intense, dangerous. I'll protect all of them, Maximilian whispered. His hand slid over Cedric's cheek. I'll protect you. Cedric's chest tightened. He leaned into Maximilian's touch. You're obsessed with me, Cedric whispered. Maximilian's mouth curled faintly. Yes. His lips brushed over Cedric's forehead. And I always will be. Cedric's eyes softened. His hand slid over Maximilian's wrist. I can live with that, Cedric murmured. Maximilian's hand slid over Cedric's waist, his touch steady and possessive. His silver eyes gleamed beneath the soft candlelight. You have no choice, Maximilian whispered. His gaze darkened. You're mine. Cedric's breath hitched. Maximilian's lips brushed over Cedric's temple. Forever. Cedric's heart softened beneath the weight of Maximilian's touch. His gaze dropped to the two sleeping bundles in his arms. His family. His future. Slowly, Cedric leaned into Maximilian's warmth. His hand slid over Maximilian's. Maximilian's arms tightened protectively around Cedric's waist. No matter what happened, no matter how dangerous Maximilian's devotion remained, Cedric knew one thing for certain. He was bound to Maximilian forever. And somehow, that didn't scare him anymore.